Hello, and welcome to the Dissidents Podcast, brought to you by the Institute for Liberal Values. This is where we talk about how we can strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society.
So welcome to this new episode of the Dissidents Podcast. Today you've got me, Jennifer Richmond, as a co-host with a new co-host, Ken Pope, with the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Thank you, Ken, for being my co-host.
Good to be here.
And we are meeting today with Helen Raleigh and Paul Prentice. And I met Helen a while ago, and Helen said that she and Paul do this presentation that they call the 3 punches to knock down democratic socialism. And I said, before you even tell me more, wait, we have to do this on a podcast. I want to share this with everyone else. So with that said, Helen and Paul, I'm just going to let you all go, and Ken and I will jump in with any questions that we might have. What are the 3 punches to knock down democratic socialism?
Okay, Helen, why don't you take it?
Okay. Well, first of all, Jennifer and Ken, thank you guys for having us on your podcast. Probably we should begin a little bit of introduction of our background, why we choose this topic. So I grew up in communist China. I have the real life experience of what life under a totalitarian regime was like. And Paul is a renowned economist. So we decided to team together because when we look at the other side, they have AOC, the young and cute, and Bernie Sanders, the supposedly old and wise, to promote so-called democratic socialism. And they attracted many young people, they fooled many young people. So Paul and I decided to get together. We decided that we also need to team up together based on both real life experience as well as Paul's knowledge in economics, and combine our expertise together to do our counterpunches. So Paul, do you have anything to add about the purpose of our talk?
Helen, we started this several years ago, and we presented it at many different venues up and down the Front Range of Colorado, and got some pretty positive feedback on it. And even though that was several years ago, it's even more relevant today, because we keep swinging further and further and further to the left. The idea of socialism or democratic socialism has become so mainstreamed, the socialists don't even pretend that they're not anymore. They used to at least pretend, but now they don't think they have to, because the entire narrative has switched to a false definition that leads people to believe that socialism is good and kind and sharing, and capitalism is greedy and nasty and bad, when it's just 180 degrees the opposite. So we developed this to try to educate people.
Before you even get started there, Ken and I have been asked this question on several occasions. What really is wrong with democratic socialism? A lot of people will conflate that and say, look at the Nordic countries. So you're absolutely right. There is this sense of longing for that, and lay out maybe this is what you'll do in the 3 punches, but kind of lay out what democratic socialism is. Like, let's define our terms, and what is the biggest concern around it.
So if I may jump in, you're absolutely right. So there's 3 punches. We begin the talk by first have a clarified definition about what socialism really is, because there's a lot of confusion. You heard people often, one of the fallacy is, well, real socialism has never been tried. Or another fallacy, which you just mentioned, is look at Nordic country, they're perfect, prospering socialism. Those are all fallacies. So our first punch is begin with the definition. Paul will explain from economics, as well as political, as well as moral, the three perspective to define what real socialism is. And then I would normally jump in to give some real life examples. So that's our first punch, just to have the definition as well as address some of the popular fallacies. And the second punch, we really is talking about the Nordic country, because there's so many confusions about Nordic country. We actually give people data points to show them that the Nordic country is not real socialism. For example, Sweden doesn't even have inheritance tax, and their corporate tax is much, much lower compared to the United States. And the third punch is all about how can we talk about socialism in a more compassionate way to address some of the popular concerns. One of them is really something's really big is about climate change and environmentalism. That's something young people is really concerned about. And so we give them real life data about why, if you really care about the environment, if you really care about the earth, you actually want to have free market capitalism than socialism, because you look at all socialist country records, they have done huge damages to to the environment. Paul, do you have anything to add?
Well, just to stay on the theme of the Nordic countries, so-called democratic socialism, they're actually market economies based on private property that have imposed a fairly large welfare state on top of the wealth-creating machine of a market economy. That's not at all socialism. When we go to our definitions, the actual definition of socialism is state or central government control of the means of production, land, labor, and capital being controlled by the state. And that's not at all what Sweden is. Now, it did actually try official socialism with government control back in the mid to late 90s, I think, Helen. And it was so disastrous that within a few years, it took one of the strongest economies in Europe down to just a miserable, miserable disaster state. And so they threw that off right away. It only lasted for maybe 3 or 4 years, I think, as an actual official socialist state. And they went back to market capitalism, where the market is allowed for free people to create the income and wealth that then they decide politically how much to distribute to other people. That's not socialism at all. That is capitalism with a large welfare state imposed on it.
So yeah, then let's go back to the first punch. I mean, I think, Paul, you kind of already got us mostly there, but how do we define democratic socialism? Let's start with your first punch.
I would say that democratic socialism doesn't have an official definition, but a common thinking of it would be something like, well, we vote ourselves into socialism. That's what democratic socialism would be, where the people decide we're going to be socialist and vote our way into it. And they soon find out that they'll have to shoot their way out, because it's very, very hard to stop it once you get it started. Sweden was successful in stopping it without having to shoot its way out, but that's very rare.
And I would just also add, democratic socialism is really oxymoron, that because democracy and the socialism are incompatible, right? Because if you look at the real definition of what is socialism, from economic sense, Paul already defined it. It's the government that control the means of production as well as distribution. So with that centralized power, there's no democracy. You have a small group of government officials make decisions about economic freedom of everybody else, and that's the environment I grew up with food rations, how much each person can eat based on gender and age. It was strictly controlled by the government. And where should we go to school? Where could we live? And including college majors. For my parents, their college majors was determined by the government based on supposedly what the government needs. So they never even had the freedom to choose what they could study at college. And once they graduated from college, the government decide what their job would be, where they had to live. And everything was tied with food ration. So as young people, you didn't even have a choice. You could not say no, because if you say no, that means starvation. And your family would hate you because everybody else was on very tight food ration. So that's the kind, so socialism and communism are anti-democracy. So this whole democratic socialism is really invented a term, try to appeal to the Westerners, but that's one of the fallacies Paul and I would address in more detail in this talk is if you want a democracy, you do not want socialism. If you want the personal freedom, you do not want socialism. If you want the economic freedom to be self-determined for your own future, how you can be responsible for better your life and your family's life, you do not want socialism.
So I just want to jump in with a question. So as you're doing these talks with folks, I mean, Paul, I think you and Helen both know, and Jennifer does for sure, that I do a lot of talks on this topic with people around the world, and I'm always surprised at how little people really know about socialism, something they say they want. So in your experience, what do you see as the most effective way to turn the light bulb on in their head to make them understand that Sweden is not really a socialist country, or all these other countries they say are socialists and working well, but they're really not. In the countries they say that, well, it really just wasn't done well. What's their excuses that you're finding, the arguments?
Sure, the brainwashing is now so deep, and frankly, the lack of critical thinking skills and discernment ability on the part of the population has devolved quite a bit just since Helen and I started this several years ago. You just have to look at, say, Venezuela. They voted themselves into socialism, and that was the last real election they ever had. When I've taught, say, at university levels, and I've taught at several universities around the state, as well as some high school programs. And I'll give an example of a high school program where I guest lectured at one of our top performing charter schools in the state of Colorado, and it's primarily with Christian-oriented, patriotic families and a lot of military families. And I was shocked at the lecture when I simply asked for a definition. What one key word would the students, this is a class of 30 students, use to describe socialism, and what one key word would they use to describe capitalism? And the majority word used to describe socialism by these good, conservative, patriotic students was sharing. Sharing. That's what they think socialism is. And the one word they used to describe capitalism was greed. And that was just, and I just simply tallied them up on the board. And then I went through describing how that's 180 degrees from reality. Here's what it is. But you have to start with precise definitions, and you have to be able to think logically from these definitions and work your way through to conclusions. And that would include decades and decades now we have of data showing the absolute abject failure of government-controlled economies everywhere, all the time. It's not just once in a while, it's every single time. And it's funny that people think that, well, we just haven't tried it right yet, or we haven't had the right people in charge of it. But when you study and understand human nature, you realize it's not possible for it to work. The only system that can possibly produce freedom and wealth is a private property system, so-called capitalism. It's getting to be an increasingly hard sell. I've got to tell you, even my last experience at university about less than a year ago, it was a hard sell.
Right. And if I may jump in, so Ken, to answer your question, I would normally begin my talk with a series of questions, right? I would ask everybody in the audience to imagine that if I'm going to be the one to decide how much they're going to eat today, and where, especially when I speak to high school students, I'm going to decide what the grade everybody's going to get, what the college major they should get. And after they graduate from college, I will be the one who decide where they're gonna go live and what their job should be. And knowing they would have a guaranteed job, they never have to worry about having a job or have things to eat. Then I ask them, how would you guys like that? And most of them would say, no, that's ridiculous. Of course not. Like, who are you, right? I said, that's a perfect reaction. I said, but all these conditions you just rejected, it was actually realities for billions of people who lived or survived under socialism or communism. Then I would go into some personal stories. And once I share some personal stories, and Paul will come in to give the actual definition. So I think a combination of real life experiences, then with a clear definition from economic, political, as well as moral. I think we have one thing we have failed to talk about is especially the moral superiority, or or moral deficiency, the moral superiority of free market and the moral deficiency of socialism. We always focus on the economic sense. We don't talk enough about the moral sense, how it is how socialism is anti-human nature. And that's, socialism appeal to the worst human nature, the envy, the jealousy, and the petty grievances. If I can give you an example about my great-grandfather, he was a landowner. And when the communists took over China in 1949, they immediately started so-called land reform. Basically, is a government-organized confiscation of landowners' land. So my great-grandfather lived in a village. Half the village actually were related to him. They shared the same family name. But communism and socialism has a way to wipe up people's petty grievances and appeal to their jealousies and envy. So his relatives, put my great-grandfather through struggle sessions, and they took everything he owned, not just land, including cattle and tools, everything away from him, because he's the one who had something, and they were the one who didn't have anything. So at the end of the day, they turned my great-grandfather from someone who was self-sustained, who could support his family and himself through hard work, into landless, poor peasants. So that's the so-called socialism sharing. It's a forced sharing. It's a confiscation of property. So there's nothing compassion about how socialism confiscated property and forcefully distributed to everyone else.
Yeah, I think you hit on something really key, though, both Paul and Helen. I think the idea, I really love that you do this, and what is socialism sharing? And I think that is it, right? I think so many people have conflated socialism with sharing. They see in the United States, a huge wealth gap. And so to them, sharing a little bit more of the wealth, maybe a little bit more welfare. I mean, that doesn't sound like a bad thing, right? I mean, where could that go wrong? So with regards from an economics perspective, Helen, thank you so much for the real life perspective. Tell us, like, what is wrong with sharing? I mean, where does that go wrong in an economic policy? Where have you seen, I mean, if you give more, real life examples of where that could go wrong and why we've seen this idea of socialism become so damaging to a country, maybe even using, for example, Venezuela as a, something for something really current to look at.
Sure. Think about it this way, maybe if I have a loaf of bread, and that's my private property under a market system, and I decide to cut it in half and give half of it to somebody, that is sharing. That is sharing. But if the government comes and confiscates that loaf of bread using force, using either gunpoint or threat of gunpoint, literally, to take that from me, and then gives it to someone else, how in the world can that fit the definition of sharing? That's simply confiscation and redistribution. So we have to get very clear about what kind of language we're using and words we're using. It's very, very, very moral to share your private property with people who you want to share it with, and people who might need it that you want to help. But that's a long ways away from having the government come in and steal it from you and then give it to other people.
Right. And I would also add that when the government play a bigger and bigger role to confiscate property and forcefully distribute the private property, that's actually anti-charity, anti-compassion. Because if you look at the people like individual giving, if you compare United States and China, people in United States actually are the most generous people, in terms of individual giving, compared to like a communist countries like China or Venezuela. Number one, because people in United States, obviously, because of the free market creates enormous wealth. So even the poor, even the relatively poor here have more things, to give, versus, in a communist country that forced distribution. That's actually anti, economic freedom. That's one thing. Second thing is, in a socialist society, because everybody assume, because the government takes such a bigger role in terms of distribution, everybody assume that the government will take care of the poor. So people actually are less inclined to give, to share for charitable causes, because they figure, hey, I already paid so much into the system that the government will take care of the poor, that it's not my job anymore. Versus here, if you look at where charitable organization first started in the United States, it was actually in the so-called Gilded Age, when people who, early immigrants who, made it from zero to millionaire, billionaires, and, either driven by religious beliefs or just, charitable, desires. And they started building private foundations and provide, because there's no government in that role. So when the government step in to take charge of distribution, that's when individuals step back. So that's why in socialism society, you actually see less voluntary sharing or caring for your neighbors. And one last thing is, socialism is a terrible economic system. So that's why you see a widespread shortages of everything in any socialist country. Venezuela is a perfect, very current example that the shortage of medicine, food, even basic, baby formulas. So when you have such a kind of a limited supply, it's become even more difficult, to share. So all things together, that the socialist country is less charitable, less actually sharing compared to free market economic system.
I like to say that government charity is an oxymoron. Charity is private giving. I mean, there's nothing private about the government taking from you. I don't feel very charitable on April 15th of every year when the government confiscates 30 to 40% of my hard-earned income. And then they decide who to give it to, instead of me being able to decide who to give it to or what to do with it. So there's just a lot of confusion in the terminology. There's a phrase in the New Testament, I can't remember exactly the quote. I meant to look it up before we came on, but forgive me. God loves a cheerful giver. That's I think it's Ephesians, I'm not sure. But a cheerful giver, well, you don't feel very cheerful on April 15th when at threat of gunpoint or actual gunpoint, because if you do refuse to pay, they will come and get you. Government takes it from you. There's nothing charitable at all about that.
Yeah, and I think that's something I want to kind of dive into too, is the compulsion component of this. So we've talked a lot about economics, but we get there, and if you look at the closing bit of the Communist Manifesto, where this one line is conveniently left out of all the advertisement for this great thing called socialism or communism, was the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. So it's not just they're going to change an economy, they're going to go in, they're going to change everything in order to make this economic model work. And that's what they have to do. So what, especially maybe this is for Helen, is how did you see that play out in communist China? Well, socialist communist China, they never really got the true communism because the government never goes away. The other secret they don't want to tell everybody is they never really get to where they want to go, but they end up in this totalitarian socialism that is just horrible. So what's your experience with that aspect of society in a communist nation?
Well, so again, socialism and communism are anti-human nature. And when we talk about economic freedom and the political freedom, they're really two sides of the same coin, right? If you don't have political freedom, it's very difficult to achieve economic freedom. That is why when in a socialist communist society, you have the government step in, not only just control economic productions and distribution, but also they become very totalitarian. They suppress people's like freedom expression, and they turn neighbors family members against each other. Everybody snitch on everybody else. The husband snitch on the wife. Wives report the husband. Children report the parents, to the government, and also it's incentivized, envy, incentivize greed, because if everybody is only allowed to have a certain amount of food, that means some people are never going to have enough, right? And there's all kinds of corruption mechanics going on for somebody to want to have some extra for themselves and their family. And that's human nature. We always want to not only better ourselves, but we'll do anything to better ourselves as well as better our family's future. And so so in China, for example, there was a black market. People will secretly trade stuff because what the government allocation, the food ration was never enough. People will trade their skill sets in order to get some actual food, or farmers will try to sell something supposedly illegally in order to get some actual food. And there were also, unfortunately, there was also opportunities to be really selfish under socialism. In my book, I record a story my father shared with me. One of our neighbors, he's a very big guy, very tall, very big. And so he used the food coupons to go get the breakfast for his family. The food coupon basically is a coupon decide how much food each person can have. And on his way back from the government-run cafeteria, he was so hungry. So this is a real story, even though it sounds like a fairy tale. He first ate his own portion. He was still hungry because he's a big guy. Then he ate his wife's portion, because he was like, well, the kids need to grow, so I'll save the kids' portion, but my wife, she'll understand. But he was still hungry, so he gradually ate all his kids' portion. And then he sat on the side of the road, started crying, big guy, pouring, like crying. And my father also went out to get a breakfast. My father saw him. My father was like, hey, Big Lee, like, what's going on? So he told my father what happened. And he was so guilt-ridden. He was like, I'm like a pig. I'm not a person. Like, I'm so evil. Like, I ate all my family's food ration. They're gonna all go hungry today, but I was still hungry. So my father shared some of our food with him, and when my father came home, he explained to us, what happened. It's a very sad story. It just shows how in such a totalitarian system, when government tightly control the distribution of everything, it's anti-human. It turns humans, it destroy your humanity. It turns you into worse than animal. You can only think about yourself, and for many people, and that's a really terrible, terrible system.
Ken, you had mentioned the Communist Manifesto, and I'm glad you've read it because not enough people actually read it. They do read it. From an economics perspective, it's unintelligible. It makes no sense whatsoever, but yet it's taken such hold in our universities. But Karl Marx set out to abolish 3 pillars of Western civilization. The first one, he said he wanted to abolish private property. The second one, he said he wanted to abolish religion. And the third one, he said he wanted to abolish the family. And look how far down that road we have gone now. And to Helen's point about human nature, I think you can go to any society in the world at any time, and you will find one of the first 5 words a 2-year-old or 1-year-old ever says, in whatever language it is, in whatever culture, along with mom and dad, mommy and daddy, is mine. We are hardwired. We are hardwired to want to have our own property. Look at how your siblings fought over toys and everything else, because you had to have ownership of something. And to try to stop that type of human nature means you have to try to stop humanity. And that's what they did. They killed over 120, maybe up to 150 million people estimated now, trying to get rid of this idea that we have self-interest, They weren't able to get rid of that idea because we are made to be that way. And so we have to channel that in some moral sense as to how we go about designing our economy and having people free to produce and trade as long as they're not hurting other people.
You said something, a self-interest, and I think it was interesting because, Helen, you were talking about how there really isn't charity under a socialist system. And I really think too, what socialism does, what I witnessed in China, is it really dampens this self-interest. I mean, if you know the iron rice bowl, if you know you're going to get the same no matter what, why even try? And so some people who these have these born with these innate abilities, perhaps to do science or math or whatnot. If you are the next great scientist, but you're going to be paid the same amount as a street sweeper, so it kind of kills ambition and it kills self-interest. And then I think that's part, like when it doesn't work, it is that self-interest and that ambition, and that's what's bubbling up to the surface in a lot of these kind of revolutions, if you will.
Right. And if I can tell you a fascinating story about the real origin story about China's economic reform. And that just showcased how this really works under socialism versus a free market. So after the communists took over China, they did a land reform. They confiscated all the land, first redistributed to poor farmers. Then eventually the government actually congregated all the land ownership. They took the land away from the poor farmers too. So nobody actually owned land anymore. And then agriculture became government organized is another job. The government official will determine what to plant, when you go to the field, when you all have to leave the field. Everything was a collective movement. So like you said, that's really destroyed everybody's incentive to actually work very hard. And of course, if nobody wants to produce, then you end up with famine and shortage of food supply. And so in 1979, after Chairman Mao died in 1976, so the Cultural Revolution officially over, but the Communist Party really struggled how to reboot China's economy because they're communists, they had no idea. So in this village, called Fengyang village, that a group of farmers, they're illiterate farmers, 18 of them, they went to their village leader, who was a Communist Party member. They basically said, look, we are starving, our family is starving, and we're also embarrassed because as farmers, we couldn't support our families. We want to make you a deal. If you allowed us to, at our spare time, like after we came back from the field work, government organized field work, if you allow us at our spare time to plan whatever we want on this small plot of land, we promise you, we're not only going to fulfill, we will fulfill the government acquisitions at the end of the year. So the Communist Party leader, he's a farmer himself, so he understood where they come from. He basically said, if I do this and we got caught, it's, I'm going to get executed by the government. You guys all have to promise you would take care of my families, especially my children, until they all turn 18. And the farmers said, okay. So they signed agreement because the farmers are illiterate. So they, put a red ink on the sum. 18 of them basically put it on this piece of paper. And the Communist Party leader was so scared. He hid this piece of paper underneath his roof. And so this secret deal was done. And then, the farmers went out, they planted this small plot of land. At the end of the year, the farmers not only fulfilled the government requisition, the production from that small piece of land was more than the entire village had produced in the past 5 years. Then it cannot it can't keep that secret anymore because everybody noticed. Not only they noticed the production level, but they also noticed how happy those 18 farmers were because they were doing something for themselves and they were willing to stay up late, got up extra early to produce something for themselves. They have extra to feed their family. They have extra to sell at the black market. And this, of course, they couldn't keep this a secret because they're way too happy compared to everybody, everybody else. So eventually, well, of course, the news broke out. The communist leader was arrested. The farmers were arrested. And but Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese communist leader, the head of the China back then, he got a hold of this news. He was like, wait. He said, don't kill them. He said, this is actually some good ideas here. And he was probably the most pragmatic one of the Communist Party member. So he took their idea and he expanded them into so-called household responsibility system, and he spread it across the country. The government still own the land, but they allow the farmers to decide what to produce, when to go to the field, and as long as they can fulfill the government requisition, they get to keep the extra. So that's actually how it started China's economic miracle in the next 30 years. 18 illiterate farmers. That just showed you when people have the freedom to decide what's best for them, the economy is going to bloom and they're going to create a prosperity and they have more to share with everybody else.
Helen, that story is sort of an echo of what we experienced in America at our very founding when the Mayflower Compact, when the Pilgrims came over. They first set up what you could call a socialist system, common ownership of property. Everybody just worked for the common good. Everybody got equal shares of whatever was produced. So nobody had any self-incentive to improve anything. So they almost starved to death in their first year. And after that, William Bradford changed the entire system they were working under and said, well, why don't you each own a piece of plot of land around our village, and you can produce whatever you want on that land, and you get to keep the fruits of that production and trade it with other people. And within 1 year, they went from a starving colony to a prosperous colony, enough to feed themselves and, as the story goes, some of the Indians at Thanksgiving.
It seems to me that really we need to flip the narrative. So democratic socialism, it sounds lovely. Capitalism, greed, like again, socialism, sharing, capitalism, greed. What if we just change the way we're using language and talk about conscious capitalism? I mean, do you think that would be a way to kind of get people? I mean, because there are issues with capitalism that people have problems with when capitalism goes a little, could go awry. Is conscious capitalism a way to counter this democratic socialism trend?
John Mackey of Whole Foods actually wrote a book called that.
John Mackey actually supports ILV, so shout out to John Mackey.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Good deal. And for sure. But keep in mind, there will always be bad actors in any society. So even a free market society, a capitalist society, a private property society will have bad actors. And that's why we have laws to keep them under control and stop them from too much wrongdoing. Would you rather have bad actors in a private market economy or bad actors in charge of the guns of government?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the difference.
I just feel like it's a messaging issue for some reason, because if people really knew what we're talking about now, Helen, what you've been mentioning, and the definition of socialism, I think that idea of sharing would melt away. And so I feel like in part this is a messaging issue, and that's why I'm thinking how else can we give new life to capitalism in a way that is attractive to the people who are now promoting democratic socialism?
Well, I'm a more purist, because I think if we try to add any adjective in front of capitalism, then basically we admit somehow it's a flawed system. I think all the flaws we've seen are caused, first of all, we are not in the full capitalism society, where never was. We got the closest probably to it in the 19th century. That's when you see the huge spike of productivity improvement, as well as poverty's dropped, infant mortality dropped, by all the measures, all the bad things dropped. So it is a messaging issue, but it's a messaging about how can we talk about the benefits of capitalism. We need to reclaim it instead of try to add adjective to it. That's why I also do not like the term crony capitalism. To me, capitalism itself is not crony. What's crony is all these people who think somehow they have the intelligence, wisdom to better a system that if you just let it freely functioning on its own, it's the best among all other systems. Just like we say, well, there are many problems with democracy, just like Winston Churchill said, right? Democracy has its own problem, but among all the systems we have, democracy is the best we have. And same thing with capitalism. So we never really give capitalism a chance. But what I can say is, based on this history of the United States, and also you look at China, the contrast between before economic reform and after economic reform, that I like to say the capitalism is like a grapevine. You just give it a little bit of room, a little bit of water, a little bit of sunshine, it will grow and have this enormous power. So we need to give it more room to grow instead of condemn it. So I do think it's a messaging problem, but it's not a messaging problem that we need to cater to the other side to say, how can we, I do believe we should talk about it in a more compassionate way, but we cannot seize the ground to say, oh, if you see wealth gap, that's a problem of capitalism. No, that's not a problem of capitalism. LeBron James deserved to make, multi-million dollars, and I don't, because he shoot way better than I do. That's not a problem of capitalism. If we see, there's a shortage of baby formula, right? We had a problem a couple of years ago. That's not a problem of capitalism. That's a problem of government regulations and cause that force it to happen. So we need to better explain the problem we see in our society and make sure, that's not get blamed by capitalism. So it is a messaging issue, but we cannot seize the moral high ground. Again, let's go back to the morality. Capitalism is the one for human nature. That's why any country even tried a little bit of capitalism or a small portion of capitalism, you see peacefulness, you see prosperity, you see better environment, you see longevity. And any country tries socialism, you see starvation, you see chaos, you see violence, because it's inherently violent, anti-human nature system.
It is, and in fact, I'm glad you mentioned that, Helen, about the phrase crony capitalism. It drives me nuts as well. Crony capitalism is business getting in bed with government. That's not capitalism at all. By definition, that is a form of socialism known as fascism. That's what Mussolini called fascism, the conjoining of big business and big government. So crony capitalism is another one of those oxymorons that sounds really good, as if there was something to it, but there isn't. Pure capitalism is the most beautiful thing that's ever been created by human beings in terms of social structure. Leading to the greatest amount of peace and prosperity for all. The fact that there are still will be some extra greedy people within any given society that might take advantage of that does not detract from it being the most productive system. And it's most productive because people have incentives to produce for themselves, to do what they want with their lives. If under a socialist system, Helen, you mentioned that the government tells you what you're going to do, what your life is going to be. So the government has all these plans for your life, but we all have our plans for our own lives. And the chances of their plans being the same as our plans are zero. That's why it always leads to strife and violence. Always. It must, because it's human nature. They try to stop human nature, and they have to use violence to do it.
You make such a good point. And as I'm talking about conscious capitalism, I mean, by saying it's democratic socialism, by adding that adjective onto it, there you're trying to, kind of take off the hard edges, and yet it's still just socialism. It's just it's just a slogan word almost, right? I mean, the way I understood you at the very beginning, what is democratic socialism? Well, there's nothing democratic about socialism, so it's really just, again, an oxymoron. So trying to add these words, we're playing the same game. My idea of conscious capitalism, I might be just playing the same game, and would just describe it as what it is.
Yes.
Yes.
Good point.
And I do believe one of the punches, third punch in our talk, it is about how can we talk about capitalism in more compassionate way. Because Paul and I, we're both Christians. We care about the poor people, and that they are some people who live in a less fortunate life compared to others. So how can we talk about why the capitalist society is actually a better system for them? There's a quote from Hayek. I'm going to paraphrase it. He basically said that it is because in capitalism that there's a private property rights, so you don't have a single entity like socialism, that single entity control the whole means of production. With that kind of private property ownership, poor people who have nothing actually have a chance to get better for themselves, because there's nobody control all the production and the distribution. So poor people will have a chance to get better. They'll have that fighting chance, and they won't have that in a social society when you have a small entity who control both the production and the distribution. And by the way, when government takes something from those who have, they never just turn around, distribute everything to the other who have not. The government officials, remember the quote from 1984, some animals are more equal than others. If the government took 100% from A, they will keep 90% to themselves, and they probably, distributed the 10%, to the people who are needs. So what the other people get are just breadcrumbs, the so-called sharing, just breadcrumbs. I have a friend who grew up in welfare, and he eventually he got out of welfare. He became an entrepreneur, and he gave a talk about the life under welfare, which really touches me. He said, yes, when you're on welfare, you get a free phones, you get a free food, you get a free housing. But he said, guess what? The free phone is the worst kind of phone you get. The free food are the most unhealthy food you get. The free housing are the most terrible housing you get. Because when you get it for free, nobody cares about the quality. So you get the lowest end of everything. So he said that he never, once he got out of that system, he became an entrepreneur. He never wanted free anything, because he said that anything has free in front of it, that's equivalent to the worst quality of something. So we can talk about how we can help other people by help them to live themselves, instead of just thinking about giving them worst of something just because it's free. It's not better in their life at all.
I think the other thing I want to pick up on a couple of things that have been said about messaging, and then Paul's thing about critical thinking. I think really, to me, what seems to be the underlying issue is not so much messaging, because I think capitalism has a great message. And I think socialism has an incredibly terrible track record and message. But I think where we have a problem is we're basically an uneducated population on this topic of socialism. Most people, we don't do history anymore, really. We really don't study it that well in school. You look at some of the test results that come out. One of them stated that, roughly 13% of our students are at or above proficient level in history. So they don't understand any of this. So they're so willing to accept, something that sounds good. It sounds fair. It sounds, everybody gets, their share, so to speak, but it doesn't really work out that way. And they don't know that. So they're willing to give up everything that they have in this nation, but they're just so, ignorant of the history of it to really appreciate it or understand it. So I think it's probably got to be a combination of both the messaging aspect, telling the truth about, how wonderful this system or form of government actually in our economic model is, and because it really does, it has changed the world for the better. and not what the other side on this argument is saying. And when I think, and Paul just hit it, being able to think critically about this, we don't really see that. The ability to look at this thing logically. If you look at it logically, this is never going to work. You could look at that in 1848 and said, this is never going to work. But yet we continue to think we can make it. So, how do we impact the education of our students, basically students and adults who are come out of this system and are now not as well educated as we would hope.
Well, we do have history, data, and logic on our side. But it's very hard to break through the emotional appeal of socialism. And I think that's what Helen was saying earlier. We need some messaging about how a market economy just creates the greatest amount of peace and prosperity for a society. And a market economy is simply another phrase for a capitalist system. And capitalism then being defined as basically the production and trade of private property. Wouldn't you say maybe propertyism might be a descriptive word to describe capitalism? It's got such a bad branded name. And one more thing, going back to the moral idea about sharing, even in America, a survey of people who self-identify as on the left versus people who self-identify as on the right, so left liberals versus right conservatives, the most generous among them by a huge margin, the conservative, much more generous in terms of giving of their own time and money to various causes to help people that are in need of help, compared to the left-leaning people who just want government to do everything, so they're less likely inclined to do it themselves. And that's a huge gap. I can't remember the exact data, but the giving gap is gigantic between the conservative side of America and the left side of America.
I've got a question. This might.
Yeah, sorry.
Well, do the Swedens and Finlands and do they call themselves democratic socialism? I'm just wondering if this is a term issue, like if people just don't understand because they see that word and to them it means, and you've already defined it, a lot of these, like Sweden it's a market economy with a heavy welfare system. But if they call themselves democratic socialists, maybe that's where part of the confusion is coming from.
Well, so I don't think I think this democratic socialism is something invented here in the United States. In Sweden they call themselves social democrat, so it's very different from democratic socialism. And
okay.
When we had this big debate a couple of years ago, the president of Sweden actually came out very strongly, declared Sweden is not a socialist country. So they call themselves a social democrat. So that's very different from democratic socialism. So I think the socialists here try to play with the basically wordsmiths. I believe our biggest challenge is we're dealing with half truth. The left the socialists are very good at playing with half truths. They will look around our system, look our society, then blame all the bad things we see as the fault of capitalism and credit all the good things, as government intervention, more socialist, policies, which is not true. So the best way to combat half-truths is to tell the whole truth, right? We should credit what's good going in our society as that's part of the system, capitalism, free market is actually working. And the things we see, the challenges we see are the result of government interventions, socialist policies. For example, why do people have more complaints against DMV versus with their iPhone, right? Because iPhone is much less regulated. It's a very competitive market. It's in a very competitive market. It's much less regulated. This is how free market works. You have constant innovation and the prices coming down and functions, service quality is improving, versus DMV. It's run by the government. There's no competition. There's government monopoly. Therefore, you have the least efficient, there's no incentive to improve upon. So I believe that's really how we need to combat this, whether it's messaging, whether it's education. We need to use the whole truth to combat the half-truth challenge. And the left is very good with half-truths. They always blame problems to capitalism. And we need to combat that with education, through media, through talks, just do everything we can.
And using precise definitions and wording.
Yes.
That's a start.
What about also, I think another thing that would be just like get your take on this too, is if you look at, pardon me for the video interruption earlier, the sound, because I was trying to pull up the Democratic Socialist website. So there's a specific definition about what they do that I wanted to share, and I hit the video by mistake, so my apologies. But anyway, what they talk about says DSA members use a variety of tactics, from legislative action to direct action, to fight for reforms to empower the working people. So already in their literature, they're hinting at violence. They're willing to do violence to get what they want. So we have a compelling story. I like to put it in simplistic terms when I give talks, is that, capitalism, arose organically from the guy who was a hunter, wanted to trade something with his neighbor, and they figured out what that equal trade would look like, and that they were both very happy. Socialism, on the other hand, is imposed on people. It never occurs naturally anywhere. The only way to make it attempt to work is through threats of violence. So how do you, I think that's a message that we need to start picking up on a little bit more, is that this is going to be a compelled system that you think you're embarking into. So how do you guys view that, and how do you guys approach it?
If we use more emotion on our side, in addition to our logic and data and critical thinking skills, but just emotion, and just tell the stories like Helen does. Here's what actually happened under socialism. Here's what it's actually like. Talk to anybody. How many people are risking 90 miles of shark-infested water to get from Miami to Havana? No, it's a one-way street, coming the other way, and there's a reason for that. How many people are trying to break across the U.S. into the Mexican border versus the Mexicans trying to break into us? There's a reason for that. And just point out the human compassionate interests of what it means, the humanity of capitalism, if you will, the humanity of free markets, the humanity of freedom itself. God created us to be free. So we can't be free in a government-controlled economy or society. So I think we missed the boat a bit by perhaps overemphasizing the prosperity end of free markets, which is just can't be doubted, all the wonderful things we have. But I think if we make more of a moral case, more of a compassionate case, and use emotion a little bit more, that would be helpful, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I keep emphasizing we need to focus on the anti-human nature of socialism, capitalism. I think it's sometimes when we were giving talk, or when I give talk on my own, when I talk about the capitalist so-called greedy versus socialist sharing, I would always ask someone, who has an iPhone. I said, give me your iPhone. And I said, who doesn't have a phone? I'll give this phone to, to the person who didn't have a phone. Would you willing to do that? Of course they don't, right? It's because, again, as Paul mentioned earlier, we are wired, we were born with very strong identity. What is mine? What's mine versus yours? And the socialism is all about destroying that. And because most of us do not want to willingly give what's mine, that's why socialism always ends up in violence. In order for the government to make the redistribution, they first have to take it from someone. And when that someone refuses to give it voluntarily, the government has to use force, and it's always end up in violence. That is why, again, when they say real socialism hasn't been tried, but if you look at it in China, in Cuba, in Venezuela, in former Soviet Union, it always end up the same way, with violence, with mass killing, with gulags, with re-education camps, with piled of bones, with deprivations. This whole trajectory has repeated regardless of language, regardless of culture, regardless of ethnicity. It has been really very well sampled and very well tested. It was very well, and 100 million people paid with their lives to prove this whole system, this whole ideology is very deadly and anti-human. And it really puzzles me that why people still want to embrace them. And we do need to do a better job. I also think we have a manpower problem, because many people, if you're a free market, if you believe in free market, you're out there busy in producing, creating, innovating, right? You're busy there, better your life, your family's life. You're not out there doing all the talks, but the other side is very good at, intellectually captured the media, the social media, traditional media, advertising, education institution, which is a big intellectual capture. So they control almost all the major platforms to constantly pump out the same messaging. So I almost want to have a call to action, hopefully through this podcast, to all people who believe in free market. Maybe once a while, you need to put down what you're doing, your innovation, your creativity, your work and something, to make sure you will stand up and talk about how important, how much you yourself and the society benefit from the free market system, to make sure this system can continue. We'll do more of it, not less of it.
One of the things as we're talking that strikes me, Helen, you said this anti-human nature. And I think that in terms of messaging, I'm really kind of tied up with language right now. I just finished a podcast talking about how we use language and left, right, and stuff like that. And I think that framing it as anti-human nature versus, left, right might actually be one of the most impactful ways, because I feel like now we're in such an us versus them system. And while there, there are certain things on that are more left leaning, more right leaning, but I think if people actually really knew what they were talking about, the way both you, Paul, and you, Helen, with your experiences, knew what they were talking about, it's not even a left-right issue. It's an anti-human issue. And I think that's really also important too in our messaging as well. I think it gets caught up in this us versus them, right versus left, and people don't fully understand. This is the critical thinking that you talk about, Paul, that it's really not this should not be a partisan thing. This really is a human issue.
I agree. Yeah, I agree. And maybe this is how we should talk about it more often. I agree. Because if you talk too much about left and right, you immediately, some people will turn it off, mentally, and they think it's become something partisan. It's really not, because I believe everybody, doesn't matter whether you're left or right, everybody deep down, we all have something in common. We want to live a better life for ourselves. We want our children and grandchildren all live an even better life than ours, and we want to pass something down to them. I mean, these are something very basic, among all humans, across all humanity, across all ethnicity, across all culture, that there's something we have in common. And capitalism is really the best system to facilitate that.
I think a great messenger for this story are folks like you, that you have come out of a communist system, then you come to this country, and within your lifetime you have done very well. And there's so many examples of, especially folks who come out of communist systems, they seem to get it. Friends from Vietnam who came over here with nothing, and as young kids, and are now, the same family two doctors and one lawyer. And then, our friend that Jen and I work with quite often, Channy Lau, who survived the Cambodian killing fields.
Wow.
And has now opened up a business in San Jose. It was a successful, government engineer for a long time too. So I think that's kind of the messaging thing, is the compassionate part, but telling those true life stories. I lived through this communist China thing, and then I came here, and this is what I was able to do in my lifetime. And what my kids now have is an opportunity that you just, like Paul said, there's not a line. I noticed that when I was living in Eastern Europe and Russia, there was a line miles as far as the eye could see in Russia trying to get into Estonia, and there was maybe one or two cars trying to go the other direction. It's that way for a reason. There's
Everywhere.
something in the West, in the Western civilization, in the US, especially America, that people long to be a part of. That is not true for all these systems that we're talking about.
Yeah, I agree. That's why I try to give more talks. I wrote books and I write articles and stuff. Hopefully I will have Paul and I, or anybody who truly, love freedom, free market, will get more opportunities to share and to constantly be on the platform, public square, to share those messages, and also through education system. Because I do not wish my experience on anyone else. And I truly believe that a well-educated person, shouldn't have to live through those kind of misery to understand the right from wrong, and what's pro-human, what's anti-human. So I think we need to use all the tools in our toolbox. Survival capitalism is definitely one of the two in the toolbox, but there are also, like, what Jennifer's doing, through the education system, what the VOC is doing through the foundation, and Paul, is teaching a college, free market. I think we have a lot of tools in our toolbox. We just need to use everything we can and constantly be out there, to get the message out. And that's really everybody's responsibility, if we all want to continue to live in freedom and the free market, and also we want to pass this down to the next generation. That's really everybody's responsibility.
Here's a phrase I use in a lot of my classes to kind of kick off a Socratic discussion, which is always fun, whether it's in high school, junior high school, or at the college level, is that I simply make a proposition that you can have a controlled economy, or you can have a free society, but you can't have both. Open that up for discussion.
Yeah.
And thank you for being part of this discussion on how we do go about having a free society, educating our audience too on some of these terms that seem so nebulous, and the need for critical thinking. So Paul, Helen, most appreciated.
Thank you so much. Enjoyed it.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
In recognition of Banned Books Week, September 22nd through the 28th this year, we are launching our inaugural book club with James LaRue's On Censorship, a public librarian examines cancel culture in the U.S. Join us for a live meeting with the author on Wednesday, October 2nd at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. In preparation for that live stream, read along with our ILV advisors who will discuss the book in 4 brief special episodes of the Dissidents podcast. They will be released on Wednesdays from September 4th through September 25th. On censorship, James LaRue issues a balanced and reasonable call to action for all citizens. It is a combination of personal reflection and a deep dive into the specifics of book banning. James LaRue has been a public library director for many years and was director of the Freedom to Read Foundation, the ALA, American Library Association's Office for Intellectual Freedom. He has written, spoken, and consulted extensively on intellectual freedom issues, leadership, and organizational development. He's engaged in community work and is invested in the future of libraries. This year, the theme of Banned Books Week is Freed Between the Lines. The annual event is a reminder of that the freedom to read is a liberal value worth defending. Learn more about banned books by checking out the American Library Association's website, ala.org.